Picture this. It's 1822, and you're standing at the very edge of what Americans consider the civilized world. Beyond the Missouri River lies a wilderness so vast, so untamed, that most folks back east can barely comprehend its scale. We're talking about a landscape where a man could walk for months without seeing another human soul, where grizzly bears the size of small horses roam freely, and where the difference between life and death often comes down to knowing which berry won't kill you. This is where our story begins, not with some gentleman explorer backed by wealthy investors, but with a man who would become the ultimate symbol of American frontier survival. A man whose methods were so revolutionary, so seemingly impossible, that they would influence wilderness survival techniques right up to this very day. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hugh Glass didn't start as a mountain man. No, his journey to becoming the most legendary survivalist in American history began in the most unlikely place imaginable, as a captive aboard one of Jean Lafitte's pirate ships in the Gulf of Mexico. Think about that for a moment. Here's a man who would later crawl 200 miles through hostile wilderness with a broken leg and exposed ribs, and his transformation story begins with Caribbean pirates. You really can't make this stuff up. The details of how Glass ended up with Lafitte's crew remain murky, but what we do know is this. Sometime around 1820, Glass found himself sailing under the Black Flag, probably against his will. Lafitte's operation was sophisticated. We're not talking about Hollywood pirates here, but organized maritime criminals who controlled trade routes and had informal agreements with various governments. Glass witnessed things during those months at sea that would have broken lesser men. The casual violence, the calculated cruelty, the way human life became just another commodity to be traded or discarded. But here's where Glass's story takes its first remarkable turn. Instead of accepting his fate, instead of becoming another forgotten victim of pirate brutality, Glass made a decision that would set the pattern for the rest of his extraordinary life. He escaped. Not through some elaborate plan or with help from sympathetic crew members, but in the most direct way possible. He jumped overboard and swam for shore. Now, when I say he swam for shore, I need you to understand what that actually meant. We're talking about the Gulf of Mexico, miles from land, with currents that could sweep a man out to sea forever. Most people would have drowned within the first hour. But Glass had something different, something that would become his defining characteristic, an absolute refusal to surrender to impossible circumstances. He made it to shore somewhere along the Texas coast, more dead than alive, with nothing but the clothes on his back. And this is where fate intervened in the most unexpected way possible. Glass was found by a Pawnee hunting party, and instead of killing him outright, which would have been the standard response to finding a lone white man in their territory, they decided to take him back to their village. The next 2 years of Glass's life would prove to be the most important education any future mountain man could receive. Living with the Pawnee, Glass learned skills that no white man of his era possessed. He learned to track elk across prairie grass so effectively that he could tell you not just which direction they were heading, but how many animals were in the herd and whether any were injured. He learned which routes could sustain a man through a brutal plains winter when game was scarce. He learned to read weather patterns days in advance by watching cloud formations and wind shifts. But, most importantly, Glass absorbed something that would set him apart from every other frontiersman of his generation, a spiritual understanding of the relationship between hunter and hunted, predator and prey. The Pawnee didn't just teach him survival techniques, they taught him to think like the wilderness itself. By 1822, Glass had become something entirely new in the American frontier experience. He wasn't just a white man who could survive in native territory. He was a cultural bridge, someone who could move seamlessly between the American fur trading economy and the complex tribal politics of the Great Plains. When William Ashley and Andrew Henry were recruiting men for their ambitious fur trading expeditions, Glass represented exactly the kind of invaluable asset they needed. Ashley understood something that many of his competitors missed. The fur trade wasn't just about trapping beaver. It was about navigating a web of relationships with dozens of native tribes, each with their own territorial claims, trading preferences, and long-standing grudges. Glass could walk into a Sioux camp and emerge with vital intelligence about river conditions. He could negotiate safe passage through Blackfoot territory, where other trappers would be killed on sight. He could read the landscape like a book, spotting signs of recent native activity that would be invisible to less experienced men. The summer of 1823 found Glass serving as hunter for a 40-man expedition pushing up the Missouri River into Arikara territory. This was dangerous work. The Arikara had recently been involved in violent conflicts with American traders, and tensions were running high. But Glass moved through this landscape with confidence born of hard experience. He could provide fresh meat for 40 men while avoiding detection by hostile war parties. He could find water sources that weren't marked on any map. He could guide the expedition along routes that minimized both natural dangers and human threats. What none of them knew, as they pushed deeper into that vast wilderness, was that Glass was moving toward an appointment with destiny. Somewhere ahead, in the breaks along the Grand River, a massive grizzly sow was protecting her cubs. She had no way of knowing that she was about to participate in creating one of the most enduring legends in American frontier history. The mathematics of survival were about to be rewritten by a man who had already proven that the impossible was simply another problem to be solved. August 23rd, 1823. If you're the kind of person who believes in fate, then this date was circled on some cosmic calendar long before Hugh Glass was even born. It started like any other hunting day in the breaks along the Grand River, Glass moving through the landscape with that particular combination of confidence and caution that marked experienced frontiersmen. The morning air carried the scent of sage and river water, and somewhere in the distance, elk were moving toward their watering holes. But Glass made a mistake that morning. Not a big one, not the kind of obvious error that gets greenhorn trappers killed in their first week on the frontier. No, this was the kind of subtle miscalculation that can catch even the most experienced woodsman off guard. He was following what appeared to be a game trail through a thicket of wild plum bushes when he stumbled into something that would change the course of American frontier legend forever. The grizzly sow was massive, and I need you to understand what that means in terms that make sense to our modern minds. We're not talking about the relatively small black bears you might encounter in a national park today. This was a Great Plains grizzly, an animal that could weigh 800 pounds and stand 9 feet tall on her hind legs. Think of the largest NFL linebacker you've ever seen, then imagine him covered in 4 inches of muscle and fat, armed with claws the length of railroad spikes, and possessed of a jaw that could crush a buffalo skull like an eggshell. She was protecting 2 cubs, which meant her aggression levels were off any scale that civilized people could comprehend. A mother grizzly with cubs doesn't just attack threats, she obliterates them. And Glass, following that game trail through the underbrush, had walked to within 20 feet of her family before either of them knew the other existed. What happened next unfolded in seconds, but those seconds would be dissected and analyzed by mountain men for generations. Glass saw the sow first, that massive brown form rising up from the thicket like some nightmare come to life. He had perhaps 2 heartbeats to make a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. His rifle was in his hands, loaded and primed. But here's the thing about fighting a charging grizzly at close range. You get 1 shot, and if that shot doesn't drop her instantly, you're going to find out what it feels like to be mauled by a creature that nature designed specifically for killing large animals. Glass took his shot. The ball struck the sow center mass, but instead of dropping her, it only enraged her further. 800 pounds of fury and maternal instinct crashed into Glass with the force of a falling tree. The impact alone should have killed him. Imagine being hit by a freight train that also happened to have teeth and claws. Glass went down hard, his rifle spinning away into the underbrush, and suddenly he was fighting for his life against an opponent that outweighed him by 500 pounds. The mauling that followed was savage beyond description. The sow's claws raked across Glass's back, laying open wounds so deep that his ribs were exposed to daylight. Her teeth found his scalp, and for a moment, Glass felt his own skull grinding against grisly molars. She grabbed his shoulder and shook him like a terrier shaking, a rat, and Glass could hear his own bones breaking with sounds like green wood snapping. But here's where Glass's years with the Pawnee saved his life. Instead of panicking, instead of fighting the bear's strength with his own inferior power, Glass went limp. He played dead with such convincing thoroughness that the sow, after several more bone-crushing bites and swipes, finally backed away to check on her cubs. Glass lay motionless in a spreading pool of his own blood, breathing so shallowly that his chest barely moved, waiting for the sound of the bear family moving away through the underbrush. When Major Henry and the rest of the expedition found Glass several hours later, they were looking at a man who should have been dead. His scalp hung in bloody strips. His ribs were visible through the torn flesh of his back. His left leg was broken in 2 places, and deep puncture wounds from the bear's teeth dotted his arms and shoulders. Most men would have died from shock alone, but Glass was conscious, his eyes tracking the faces of his companions as they stood over him in stunned silence. The group faced a brutal calculation. They were deep in hostile territory, carrying valuable furs and trade goods that represented months of dangerous work. Every day they delayed increased the chances of attack by Arikara war parties. Glass was clearly dying. Nobody could survive wounds that severe, not out here, not without proper medical care. The humane thing would be to stay with him until the end, but humanity was a luxury that 40 men in Indian country couldn't afford. Major Henry made the kind of decision that frontier commanders had to make. He called for volunteers to stay with Glass until he died, then catch up with the main party. It was a death sentence for whoever stayed, and everyone knew it. 2 Arikara warriors could easily kill 2 or 3 mountain men, especially men distracted by caring for a dying companion. John Fitzgerald volunteered first. Fitzgerald was older, more experienced, and possessed of the kind of calculating mind that saw opportunity in every crisis. Young Jim Bridger, barely 19 years old, and on his first major expedition, volunteered second. Whether from genuine compassion or peer pressure, nobody could say. As the main party disappeared into the wilderness, Fitzgerald immediately began working on Bridger's mind. Every hour they stayed, he argued, was an hour closer to their own deaths. Glass was unconscious most of the time, clearly slipping away. The Christian thing would be to end his suffering, but since neither man could bring himself to do that, the next best thing was to take what they could carry and rejoin the expedition before it was too late. For 3 days, they waited for Glass to die, and Glass, despite wounds that would have killed most men in hours, refused to cooperate. On the morning of the 4th day, Fitzgerald made the decision that would echo through frontier folklore forever. He convinced young Bridger that staying meant death for all 3 of them, and that taking Glass's equipment was simply salvaging useful gear from a dead man. They took everything. Glass's custom rifle, hand-forged by a master gunsmith in St. Louis, his possibles bag, containing his powder, shot, flint, and steel, his skinning knife, honed to razor sharpness and balanced perfectly for field dressing game. They even took his fire kit, leaving him without any means of making warmth or cooking food. When Glass regained consciousness, he was alone in a wilderness that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, armed with nothing but his rage and an impossible will to live. 200 miles. When you're driving down the interstate at 70 miles per hour, 200 miles represents less than 3 hours of your life. But when you're lying broken and bleeding in the Dakota wilderness with no weapons, no fire, and wounds that expose your internal organs to the elements, 200 miles might as well be the distance to the moon. Glass spent his first conscious hours taking inventory of damage that would have sent most men into shock-induced unconsciousness. His scalp hung in strips, but he could still think clearly. His ribs were exposed, but his lungs seemed to be working. His left leg was definitely broken, but the bone hadn't punctured the skin. Most importantly, his hands still functioned, and his years with the Pawnee had taught him that a man with working hands could solve almost any survival problem if he was willing to think like the wilderness itself. The first innovation came from necessity and desperation in equal measure. Glass's wounds were already showing signs of infection, the kind of putrefying rot that killed frontiersmen more often than Indian arrows or grizzly claws. But as he lay there, watching flies buzz around his torn flesh, Glass remembered something the Pawnee medicine men had taught him about the relationship between decay and healing. He let the flies lay their eggs in his wounds. Think about that for a moment. This man, reduced to the most primitive state imaginable, made a conscious decision to allow maggots to feast on his infected flesh. To modern sensibilities it sounds horrifying, but Glass understood something that medical science wouldn't formally recognize for another century. Maggots eat only dead tissue, leaving healthy flesh untouched. Within days, his wounds were cleaner than they had been since the attack. But cleaning wounds was only the beginning of Glass's problems. He needed tools, and the nearest hardware store was about 150 years in the future, so Glass began crafting implements from materials that most people would consider useless debris. Sharp-edged flint became cutting tools, driftwood branches became digging sticks and walking supports. Buffalo hide, scraped from old kills he discovered, became containers for carrying water and cordage for binding two materials together. The Pawnee had taught Glass to navigate by reading natural signs that white men typically ignored. Star positions told him direction, even on cloudy nights. River flow patterns indicated which tributaries would lead toward major waterways. Animal behavior revealed weather changes days in advance. Wind directions and cloud formations became his compass and calendar, guiding him toward Fort Kiowa with precision that would have impressed trained surveyors. Movement itself became an engineering problem that Glass solved through pure innovation. His broken leg made walking impossible, but crawling 200 miles would have taken months and probably killed him through exhaustion. So Glass developed a technique that was part crawl, part slide, part controlled roll that allowed him to cover ground without putting weight on his damaged limb. He learned to read terrain like a topographical map, choosing routes that minimized elevation changes and maximized the distance he could travel between rest periods. Food presented perhaps the greatest challenge. Hunting was impossible without weapons, and foraging required knowledge that most white men simply didn't possess. But Glass's years with the Pawnee had taught him to think like a scavenger as well as a hunter. He learned to locate ground nests and steal eggs without disturbing the parent birds enough to attract attention. He discovered which insects were edible and which would make him sick. He found wild onions and prairie turnips that could sustain him through days when other food sources weren't available. The most remarkable innovation came when Glass encountered a wolf pack that had made a fresh kill. Wolves are not animals that share their meals with strange humans, but Glass had learned something from watching Pawnee hunters that gave him a crucial advantage. Fire was the one thing that wolves feared more than they valued their food. Using flint and steel technique he had perfected during his Pambliss captivity, Glass built a fire from dried grass and buffalo chips, then used burning brands to drive the pack away from their kill long enough to claim a substantial portion of fresh meat. But perhaps Glass's most impressive survival technique involved his mental approach to impossible circumstances. Lesser men would have been overwhelmed by the scale of their situation, broken, alone, 200 miles from safety, through territory controlled by hostile tribes. Glass broke the journey down into manageable segments, setting daily goals that seemed achievable even in his condition. Today's goal might be reaching that stand of cottonwoods. Tomorrow's might be crossing that creek. By refusing to think about the full scope of his situation, Glass maintained the psychological strength necessary to continue moving forward. His encounters with native hunting parties became exercises in cultural diplomacy that would have challenged experienced ambassadors. Glass's knowledge of multiple tribal languages and customs saved his life repeatedly. When Sioux warriors discovered him crawling across their territory, Glass was able to identify himself as someone who had lived with the Pawnee and understood proper protocols for requesting safe passage. Instead of killing him as a trespasser, they provided him with basic supplies and directions to water sources. The physical transformation that occurred during those 6 weeks was nothing short of extraordinary. Glass's body adapted to crawling in ways that defied normal human physiology. His shoulders and arms developed strength that allowed him to pull his full body weight across miles of rough terrain. His hands became so calloused that he could grip sharp rocks and rough wood without injury. His broken leg, immobilized by improvised splints, began healing in a way that would allow him to walk again. As Glass approached the final stretch toward Fort Kiowa, he was no longer the same man who had been mauled by that grisly sow. The Hugh Glass who crawled into the fort 6 weeks later was something entirely new in the American frontier experience. A man who had been reduced to the most primitive survival conditions imaginable, and had not just survived, but had innovated techniques that would influence wilderness survival for generations to come. When the gates of Fort Kiowa finally came into view, Glass wasn't arriving as a broken survivor begging for mercy. He was arriving as a man reborn with singular purpose, already planning his next move in a game that was far from over. Hugh Glass walked into Fort Kiowa on October 1st, 1823, and the first thing he did was ask for weapons. Not medical attention, not a hot meal, not even a place to rest his still healing bones. Weapons. The garrison surgeon took one look at Glass's scars and declared his survival a medical impossibility. But Glass wasn't interested in discussing the finer points of frontier medicine. He had business to conduct, and that business required a rifle, powder, shot, and a good knife. The story of his crawl had already begun spreading through the fur trade network, with the speed that only truly extraordinary tales achieve. Trading post operators passed it along to river pilots. Mountain men shared it around campfires. Native tribes incorporated it into their oral histories as an example of the kind of supernatural determination that white men occasionally demonstrated. But Glass wasn't interested in becoming a legend. He was interested in tracking down John Fitzgerald and Jim Bridger, and he was willing to cross a frozen continent to do it. The mathematics of frontier justice were more complex than simple revenge. Glass understood that his survival had already accomplished something unprecedented. He had proven that techniques learned from native peoples could overcome circumstances that traditional European survival methods couldn't handle. Every trading post between Fort Kiowa and the Yellowstone was now discussing his innovations. Mountain men were experimenting with his maggot therapy technique. Trappers were studying his improvised tool-making methods. His crawl across Dakota Territory was becoming a master class in wilderness survival that was revolutionizing how frontiersmen thought about extreme situations. But first, Glass had personal accounts to settle. Intelligence from incoming traders placed young Bridger at Fort Henry on the Yellowstone River, working for Major Henry's operation. Fitzgerald had reportedly enlisted in the United States Army and was stationed at Fort Atkinson near present-day Nebraska. Glass planned to visit both men, but not for the reasons that frontier justice typically demanded. The winter journey to Fort Henry tested survival skills that Glass had perfected during his crawl. Traveling alone through territory where temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero, Glass employed techniques that other mountain men considered suicidal. He built shelters using principles he had learned from the Pawnee, structures that could preserve body heat even in blizzard conditions. He navigated by stars when landmarks disappeared under snow. He found food sources that most men wouldn't recognize as edible. At trading posts along his route, Glass discovered that his methods were already being documented and taught. Experienced trappers were keeping journals that recorded his innovations in detail. Young mountain men were practicing his fire-starting techniques and shelter-building methods. The story of his survival was becoming more than entertainment. It was becoming education that could save lives in situations where traditional frontier wisdom fell short. The confrontation with Jim Bridger at Fort Henry became one of the most remarkable examples of frontier mercy on record. Glass found the young man working at routine camp duties, clearly expecting to die the moment Glass appeared. Bridger had spent months living with the guilt of abandoning a man who had treated him fairly, and his relief at seeing Glass alive was genuine. But instead of demanding satisfaction, Glass studied the terrified 19-year-old and made a decision that surprised everyone present. Glass forgave him, not because Bridger deserved forgiveness, but because Glass recognized something that frontier justice often missed: the difference between a young man's mistake and an older man's calculated betrayal. Bridger had been manipulated by Fitzgerald, and punishing him would accomplish nothing useful. Instead, Glass spent several days teaching Bridger advanced survival techniques, passing along knowledge that could keep him alive in future emergencies. The pursuit of Fitzgerald to Fort Atkinson required Glass to navigate military bureaucracy that was far more complex than wilderness survival. Fitzgerald had enlisted using his civilian skills as leverage for better assignments, and he was protected by army regulations that civilian justice couldn't touch. The confrontation, when it finally occurred, was anticlimactic. Fitzgerald returned Glass's rifle, claiming he had been safeguarding it, but offered no apology for the abandonment. Glass realized that revenge was less important than reputation. His survival story was worth more than satisfaction from men who had already revealed their true character. The techniques he had developed during his crawl were being adopted throughout the Rocky Mountain fur trade. His innovations were saving lives from the Columbia River to the Rio Grande. His legend was becoming a teaching tool that would outlast any personal vendetta. Glass returned to the mountains, but he wasn't the same trapper who had been mauled by that grisly sow. He had become something entirely new, a systematic innovator whose survival methods were revolutionizing frontier life. At rendezvous gatherings, experienced mountain men sought him out to learn his techniques. Young trappers studied his methods like students learning from a master craftsman. Trading post operators documented his innovations in journals that would influence wilderness survival training for generations. The final decade of Glass's life was spent refining and teaching survival techniques that bridged native and European approaches to wilderness challenges. He developed systematic methods for reading weather patterns, locating water sources, and improvising tools from natural materials. His innovations influenced everyone from individual trappers to military expeditions planning extended operations in hostile territory. Hugh Glass died as he had lived, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in frontier conditions. In December 1833, Arikara warriors killed him and 2 companions on the frozen Yellowstone River. He was in his 50s, ancient by mountain man standards, and still traveling through territory that younger men considered too dangerous to enter. But Glass's real legacy wasn't his death. It was the systematic approach to wilderness survival that he had developed during his impossible crawl across Dakota Territory. His techniques became the foundation for military survival training programs. His innovations influenced explorers pushing into previously unmapped territories. His story became the template for understanding how human beings could adapt to extreme circumstances through intelligence, determination, and willingness to learn from cultures that understood survival as a way of life rather than an emergency skill. The legend of Hugh Glass lives on not because he survived an impossible situation, but because he transformed that survival into knowledge that continues saving lives today. Every wilderness survival manual, every military training program, every expedition into hostile territory carries traces of innovations developed by a man who refused to accept death as the only solution to impossible circumstances.